So there are many components of cleft lip repair, and for the purposes of today's session, I'm going to focus on the plan. We'll go over the design and how that design can adjust to the spectrum of clefts, and we'll talk about some considerations relative to rotation advancement. This repair was initially described in 2005, and although it's a good repair, it looks very complicated because of the many points involved. What I'd like to show you is that it's actually not that complicated. I've removed the numbered points, and if you look at actually those points, they're all standard anthropometric landmarks that an experienced cleft surgeon should already be able to recognize, and any new cleft surgeon should learn about. I'll talk about some modifications that also make these designs easier. Now, we always start from the midline point, go to the non-cleft side, and then go to the cleft side, which is less distinct and harder to identify. So here's the center of the columella and the top of the philtral column on the non-cleft side, on the medial edge of the philtral column. From there, we simply transpose the landmark to the cleft side, where things are less easy to define. Here's the base of Cupid's bow as well as its peak, and the peak is defined where the peak transitions from the straight part of the Cupid's bow to the gently convex portion. It is also on the medial edge of the philtral column. So we take that landmark and we transpose it to the cleft side. We identify the landmarks above the white roll and as well along the wet-dry junction, the so-called red line. There are the landmarks at the base of the ala, the subalare, the lowest point of the ala, and then the alar insertion point, which, if you follow the rim of the nose and see where it intersects this nasal sill, that's where we place that landmark. We go to the cleft side and identify the same landmarks, but if you notice here, the configuration of those landmarks is asymmetric, and that's because those landmarks are identified with the lip and the nose in their corrected form. When you let the nose down and the lip spread apart, the ala rotates outwards and the asymmetric configuration resumes. Now, if you manipulate the nose, you can see a crease developing at the base of the columella and extending along the medial foot plates. There's another crease that originates from the ala and eventually intersects with that other crease. Where these two creases intersect is what I call point X. And in the original description, this is point number 15, the so-called arbitrary point. This point is useful because you can transpose it onto the cleft side and identify the point of nasal closure on one side of the cleft and on the other side of the cleft, simply transposing the distances and using the previously identified landmarks. So when you bring these 2 points together, it produces the nose that you want. From here, it's a simple matter of connecting the dots. Here's the philtral column, incision that runs perpendicular to the lip, incision along the columella and the medial foot plate, and then the back cuts above the white roll as well as along the red line. From here, we move to the lateral lip and identify Nordhoff point. If you follow the red line as well as the vermilion border, there's a region where the two lines start to converge, and that's Nordhoff point. Medial to that point, the white roll starts to disappear. Lateral to it, it's well defined. There's the corresponding landmark above the white roll as well as along the wet-dry junction. If you look at the vermilion height here and compare it to the non-cleft side, they're generally equivalent. And so you can take the deficient vermilion height on the medial side of the cleft, transpose it to Nordhoff point to define the triangle that you need in order to augment the vermilion height along the cleft. It's here that we stop. Up until now, we've been identifying landmarks and simply connecting the dots. We now have 2 fixed landmarks where we need to fit our lateral lip elements to correspond with the medial lip elements, but also augment the medial lip. A is the height of the philtral column on the non-cleft side, B is the height of the philtral column on the cleft side, and C is the base width of the triangle that's needed to augment the medial lip height. There's a Rose-Thompson effect with lengthening, and so we subtract 1 millimeter. The configuration of the lateral lip elements can be a little bit confusing because it relies upon the available lateral lip height. One way to think of it is that you've got three components: the sill limb in black, the philtral limb in red, and the triangle flap in green. If you imagine that there's a hinge between each of the three components, and much like an articulating ruler, those hinges allow things to be collapsed down or expanded out as needed. So if we return back to this diagram, we have those two fixed points, and we can think of drawing little arcs that correspond to the limbs that we need. And so there's the sill, there's the base width C, and if we take the height of the philtral column that we need to fit between those two arcs, we simply place it where those arcs can be connected and simply connect the dots to complete the markings. Here it is in real life, and this is immediately post-op. Now what I've gone through is a kid with a complete cleft lip and a Subunit band. So let's slide along the spectrum and look at a kid with a complete cleft lip and palate. The landmarks are identified in a similar way, with the points of nasal closure along each of these creases at the base of the nose. When you bring those 2 points of closure together, they reflect the non-cleft side, and it produces the nose that you want. When you let the nose droop back down and the lips spread back out, the configuration of those landmarks becomes asymmetric once again. From there, we identify Cupid's bow as well as Nordhoff point, and then the landmarks above the white roll, as well as along the wet-dry junction, the red line. It's a simple matter of connecting the dots before we get to the next stage, where we have to design lateral lip elements between these two fixed points. A minus B minus 1 millimeter is C, and because we have a deficiency of lateral lip height, we need to collapse things down. So we can draw those arcs corresponding to the sill limb as well as the base width C. We can connect those two arcs with the philtral height B, and then connect those dots to complete the markings. Here, one of the surfaces of the triangular flap is coincident with the philtral height, the B limb. These are the markings in real life, and then immediately following repair. Now if we slide along the spectrum and look at a kid with an incomplete cleft lip, the landmarks are much the same, and we simply connect the dots. Again, the 2 points of nasal closure are defined so that when they're brought together, it produces the nose that we want. One of the nice things about incomplete clefts is that you can use Hagar dilators or urethral sounds to measure the diameter of each nostril and calculate the circumference so that you can figure out how much you can excise from the nostril floor without producing a micronostril. Again, we end up at that juncture where we have two fixed points and we need to fit our lateral lip elements. A minus B minus 1 millimeter is C, and this is what not to do. I previously told you could draw arcs and connect the arcs with the philtral height B, but when you do that, the angle between the sill limb and the B limb don't match up. One side's very acute, one side's very obtuse, and things don't fit together. So in this case, we need to drop the B limb down, draw the sill limb in, and then excise the excess lateral lip height so that the angle between the sill and the B limbs matches up. This is what it looks like in real life, and then immediately following repair. You can see that that triangular excision tucks in really nicely into the base of the ala, and that's because the excision is designed along the alar crease. If we look further along the spectrum at a more minor incomplete cleft lip, there's nose asymmetry, so the repair needs to extend up to the nasal sill, but A minus B minus 1 millimeter is 0, and so there's no need for a back cut or a triangle. Moving further along the spectrum and looking at a microform cleft lip, this is what the repair looks like. In order to arrive at the design, we identify all the same landmarks, but this time the 2 points of nasal closure are coincident because the nose is symmetric, and so we don't need the portion of the repair that extends up to the nasal sill, and we therefore simply taper off to an apex and then close the lower portion. So that's the spectrum and how to apply this design. If you come from a rotation advancement background, there are some important differences. The first is that the base of the ala and the upper lip are dealt with as a single unit, which for me, I think is a little bit simpler. The second is that the landmarks are considered fixed and based on anatomy. In contrast, if you do a rotation advancement and you run into the situation where you're deficient on lateral lip height, you'll tend to migrate the point of lip closure on the lateral side of the lip further lateral. When you do that, you produce additional vertical height, but it's at the expense of lip width. The consequence of that is this accordion effect where you thin out the lateral lip. While a fissure repair may take longer to plan, it's probably a little bit faster when it comes to tailoring because everything's predetermined. The last difference may be the learning curve. This is my first case in practice. And this is a sample from my first 100 consecutive cases in practice. We found that early in the experience versus late in the experience, the outcomes were similar, and this is in contrast to rotation advancement where there's a well-known learning curve. So I've gone over this repair and hopefully shown you that it really is a system of landmarks that helps to define a design. Because it's based on landmarks, it adjusts on its own to the spectrum of clefts. It's okay to excise a vertical wedge as needed, and there are important differences relative to rotation advancement. The lip and ala are dealt with as a single unit, and all of the landmarks, including Nordhoff point, is fixed. Again, there's lots of components of cleft lip repair, and I've taken a deep dive into surgical planning. I'm often asked, well, what do I do with the nose? And we recently wrote that up. If you're serious about this repair, I would suggest taking a deeper dive. There is a 1-hour webinar on the ACPA website called Cleft Lip Repair, Measure Twice, Cut Once, and I've left my email address if anybody has questions or wants to reach out and has anything that they want me to address further. Thanks so much.